Just want to welcome you now. I'm Jerry Conacher. We're winding down on this great series on St. Louis de Montfort's treatise, True Devotion to Mary. We're going through this book adapted by Eddie Doherty, published by the Montfort Fathers. And we have with us Father Hugh Gillespie and Father Bernard Geiger, who are guiding us through this book. They're a great team. They really coming at it from two different directions, both in love with Our Lady, and this has been a great series, Father. It really is. We're on part 2, actually, of the chapter on wonderful effects of consecration now.
We come now to the last effect, and as I said, these effects build on one another, and so we come to the capstone effect now. And Montfort says the final, or the 7th effect of this devotion in our lives is the greater glory of Jesus Christ. This is the point. This is the point. The point is the glory we give to Christ, who in turn glorifies his Father. As Montfort writes very boldly, by being perfectly faithful to this devotion, you give more glory to Christ in a month than you could by any other, even by a harder one, in many years. And so he continues that comparison we saw in the last effect of the two ways of making a statue, and how the more difficult way is not necessarily the better way.
The chisel or the mold.
Right. And Montfort is saying here again, just because it's a more difficult way, a superficially more demanding way, doesn't make it a more effective way. It just makes it harder. And but the real effect, and the capstone effect, the point of all of this, is the greater glory of God. And so Montfort says there are 3 ways that this devotion and our faithfulness to it, or 4 ways actually, bring about the greater glory of Jesus Christ. And he says the first is, when we let go of our own intentions, we begin to participate in the sublimity of Mary's intentions, this perfect harmony with the will of God and the desires of God and the heart of God. And this, of course, this perfect conformity to her Son, allows Jesus to be magnified, allows Jesus to be manifest in our lives, as we just saw in the previous effect. The second one is that precisely because we're relying on the attitudes of Mary, Mary, in a sense, functions as a mediator for us. Remember Montfort's stress of the humility of having a mediator, of having someone to aid us approach Jesus. And he said, of course we can approach Jesus directly. Of course we can do that. The issue is not whether we can or whether we can't, but all too often when we seek to approach the Lord directly, we do it pridefully. We do it without truly appreciating who it is we encounter. And so we want to step back, and when we recognize who it is we approach, we realize it's best to go with someone else.
That's right.
And Montfort says this humility where we humble ourselves, is in and of itself a glorification of the Lord. Because by humbling myself and approaching him, I recognize and acknowledge his greatness. And he says it very powerfully here. It reaches deeper into the virtue of humility than it would when we rely upon ourselves. So by relying on Mary, the virtue of humility becomes deeper within me. And when I humble myself, by extension, I exalt the Lord. When I exalt myself, who do I humble? I humble God. And so Montfort is saying here, this humility, the deeper one's humility, the higher the glory of God. Only the little ones, the humble of heart, truly glorify him.
Only the children of God will
We
have to be like a child before entering the kingdom of heaven.
And then Montfort says, because of Mary's great love for us, she is eager to receive the gift of our actions. Now, this is a remarkable image of Mary, as she's waiting on us to give her something. She's excited, she's eager to receive what we can give her, because then she can do something with it. She can transform it and place it into the hands of her Son. And so our actions are multiplied, amplified, and magnified
that's the key.
By the presence of Mary.
Yeah, because Mary literally takes a little, if we understand what you taught a couple of shows ago when we read Cardinal Chiappi's letter, by the kindly mystery of God's will, a supernatural solidarity reigns among men. The consequence of the sin of one person harms other people just as one person's holiness. So every time we're holy and good, we're meriting, and we're putting that into the mystical body of Christ, helping the entire mystical body. But now you're saying this is multiplied. When we give it to her,
Exactly.
she multiplies it.
she purifies it.
Yes.
Because again, the best of our actions are colored by mixed motivations.
Right.
The best of our actions fall short
Yes.
of being completely good. So by surrendering them again,
Yes.
by surrendering them and by surrendering our control of them, what we do is we are no longer the owners of our good works. And so we can allow God to possess them completely as well. And this amplifies their value. This does greater glory to Jesus than my saying, I'm going to do this for the Lord and I'm going to set the agenda for how I do it. Which right away says, it's also about glorifying me.
Yes, right.
And then fourth, Montfort says, we never engage, meet, think about Mary without her immediately turning and engaging, thinking about, and glorifying the Lord. And this is important as well. The more Mary becomes the ambient in which I live, the more Christ is glorified. The more glory Christ has, the greater glory God the Father has. And so Montfort says, for these reasons, this devotion does more glory to Jesus, to his name, to his kingdom, to his Father, than any other devotion or any other way I could seek to glorify him. And isn't that the point of a true spirituality, a truly healthy Christian life? But the greater glory of God. This is what we seek.
Father Bernard, one of your insights.
Yes, and again, the question is, well, how does that happen? How is it? Why and how does it glorify God more? And as I've mentioned previously, glory is basically the manifestation of goodness. The more you see a person's goodness, and that which makes you see the person's goodness, that's the glory. And that's why we talk about the light of glory. And that's the light that ultimately we will have in heaven. Right now we have the power to see God if we are in sanctifying grace, but we don't see him. Why not? Well, because we don't have the light of glory yet. The light of glory enables us to see God, to see that he is infinite goodness in person, infinite truth in person, infinite communion of love in person. That's what we'll see when we have the light of glory. And so this is how we start to glorify God as we turn ourselves over to our Blessed Mother and we start placing our trust in her. And she then begins to reveal to us God's goodness because we have surrendered all of this to her. We don't see these things until she does help us to see them. But then others seeing us will also begin to see something of God's goodness. And so this is how we're glorifying God more, by turning ourselves over to Mary. This is the practical way in which that happens.
On the last program, we were talking about hurts in families and how that can cause such division. And Father Jack, our local pastor here, I went to one of his masses, and he gave a sermon. He used to be the chaplain at the 2 hospitals. He said over the years, I think I've witnessed over 5,000 deaths. And he said, appalled when I have families coming together, either the person has died or is dying, and they don't talk to one another. He said it's the magnitude of it is unbelievable. At that tender moment, you think there would be openness and forgiveness, but the bitterness still goes
coming
right
together.
Yeah, coming together. And so we have to not look for justice, but let go on ourselves. We have to be just to others, but we don't have to work about justice. We have to let go and give that to Our Lady and really let go of it. And then we'll have that. That's what the consecration is all about.
When my mother died, the undertaker told me the same thing. He said, so often when there's a funeral, families split up. Instead of coming together. He says, I see your family coming together. He says, that's very unusual.
Yeah, it's amazing. You would think they would come together at that time. But this means that only those that love you can hurt you, really. So when your family is closest to you, so something's happened and it's hurt, but we just have to let go, give it to Our Lady, and then this consecration will really take deep root.
Right. But we want to be careful here, too, because the movement to reconcile is not an easy movement to make.
Right.
And when the wound is great You know, it's not only that those who love us can hurt us, but it's a matter of when we love greatly and our trust has been greatly violated, the wound itself is great.
Yes.
And it's not a simple matter at times to recover from that or to overcome that. So the importance is to be willing to do the work, to let that go. But recognizing, though, that it may take time.
Yes.
It may take time to let the hurt aside, to let the wound aside, because the hurt has been that great. And one of the things we don't want to do is trivialize that, because unfortunately a lot of damage is done in our families.
Yes.
And that's not easily, if we set it aside too lightly, we don't fully acknowledge what has happened. And that's the tricky thing. But you're right, the key is we can't let that master and dominate our lives.
Right.
We can't let that become what controls us. Because in the end, it poisons everything we do. It poisons who we are. It doesn't just poison the family, it poisons the individual.
Yes.
And
So it's not easy. I mean, the
Right.
hurts are there, but so often we're waiting for that. We want the person to totally humble themselves and apologize over and over again, let everybody know.
And that doesn't really heal anything.
Right.
I mean, it can help, but it doesn't. It's not really what heals.
Right.
Yeah.
But and you know, one of the realities is the cross is the ministry of reconciliation. Jesus reconciled sinners through the blood of his cross,
Yes.
through the carrying of his cross. And the same thing, at times the cross which comes to us, which is often the cross most difficult to bear, is that cross of reconciliation
Yes.
in the home, in the family, in our relationships. And that cross sometimes of the internal reconciliation we also need to do.
Right. Well, this is hitting so many families today. So we're just saying, on your own level, don't look for justice. Be merciful on your own level. It's different. Be just to other people, but and to ask for that forgiveness, but then to forgive. And forgiveness is such a powerful. Well, it's an absolute prerequisite for salvation anyway. I mean, if we don't forgive, we're not going to be saved, and we know that for sure. Scripture is very adamant there. So I think this consecration could be a powerful means to get the grace to let go,
Right.
and to really forgive.
It certainly can, and just as this consecration is a process, so is forgiveness.
Yes.
And we recognize that if I can't let everything go right now, I can let some of it go.
Yes.
And I can begin moving in that direction, and that's the important thing, is the forward movement which prevents me
Right.
from being a prisoner.
Yes. My holiness doesn't depend on the other person's holiness. Yeah, I think that's so often, well, I don't see them really sorry, so how can I can't forgive until I really see sorrow from them. Well, that's not the part of it. You know?
Right.
We're to forgive without even that other person really apologizing to the depths of their soul. So I think this is something we have to get out there, because it's impacting on almost every family. And this consecration can be a powerful means
Yes.
to turn that around. So, Father, where are we now?
We're at the start, chapter 15. And the better title for this chapter and the following chapter would be the subheading here, Practices Proper to True Devotion. Because in these two chapters, which are the final two chapters, we're going to talk about the external and the internal practices now that Montfort says are intrinsic
Right.
to this devotion. So having talked about the devotion all the way along, Montfort is
Right.
finally going to paint a picture for us and say, this is what it looks like. Okay, this is what you need to do. And curiously, he's reversing himself here. Previously, he spoke about all the internal dimensions first,
Yes.
and then added the external in. Now he's reversing himself and saying, let me show you the external aspects of this,
Okay.
and then we'll get to the internal.
Okay.
And one could say, well, why would you do this? Isn't a real devotion, a real spirituality, an internal reality? And Montfort would say, of course it is. But if it's only an internal reality that never comes to some kind of external, visible, concrete expression in the nuts and bolts of our lives, then it's not real.
Okay.
You know, then we're living in Never Never Land, because, you know, one of the things one hears a lot these days is the expression, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. And you know, that's a curious statement when one thinks about it. Because at best, at its core, what religion is allowing, whether it's organized religion in the traditional sense, or or a private, unique religion. What religion truly is the concrete expression of the spiritual aspect of my persona. And so if I say I'm spiritual but I'm not religious, often what I'm saying is I don't let my spirituality actually claim my decisions, actually claim my actions, actually come to expression in my life, in which case the question can be, are you really spiritual or are you dreaming? Are you grabbing an illusion?
Yes.
Montfort is going to say, no, if this is going to be a true spirituality, yes, it must be internal, and we will talk about that. But there has to be some kind of manifestation in my life, in the concrete of my life, for this to be a genuine way. A true devotion, a true spirituality has an internal and an external component, and they are related. And so Montfort says, exterior practices well performed help perfect the interior actions. And they remind a man who is always guided by his senses, and that's so true,
Yes.
of what he has done or has to do. And then, too, these outward signs of inward devotion help to edify others. There are three main reasons why we look at these external actions. First, they help to perfect the internal elements, the internal movements of the spirituality. In a sense, they mirror them so we can see them
Okay.
and test them and see where we need to grow. Then he says they remind us of what we are about. One of the reasons we have so many gestures and symbols in our own tradition is they remind us. They call our attention once again to refocus ourselves on who we truly are and what we truly need to do. Memory is important and necessary. And Montfort says these external actions are our badges of memory. They help call to our attention again so we don't forget, because we do forget, because we do get distracted, and they refocus us. And then he says, frankly, our lives are not disconnected from the lives of other people, and we need to remember that. If I'm baptized into Jesus, it's not just that I share life with Jesus, but I share life with you.
Yes.
Because our lives are mingled as well in baptism, because we are both members of the same body of Christ.
Yes.
And the same Spirit of Christ is within us. And so Montfort is saying, my external actions have an effect on those around me, and I want that effect to be edifying. And so the external practices of this devotion as well should have a good, edifying, and beneficial effect on others. They should witness to the value of a good Christian life. They should witness to the value of this devotion, and they should attract others to its practice. So that's why Montfort says we want to look at these, and we don't want to ignore these, and we don't want to say that these are in any way unimportant.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah, they're very important. Reminds me of what St. Bonaventure said, that God has created the visible, material, external world, external in a sense it's not within our souls, as expressions of the spiritual world, as reflections and representations of the spiritual world. In other words, we, since we're made up of both spirit and material, body and soul, we have to have both. Without the external, without the concrete, without the visible, we will never come to a knowledge of what the spiritual is, because the concrete and the visible and the tangible reflect the reality of the spiritual world. And this is how we get to know the internal, the spiritual world, is through the visible and the concrete and the tangible. And so that is why these exterior practices are so important. Without them, we don't get to know it. And without us becoming what we're supposed to be, others who see us and live with us, they won't get to know God either, because they too depend upon the material to get to know what the spiritual is.
This is why so many Franciscan churches are so beautiful with the statues and everything else. I mean, it helps us.
Yes.
It helps us. So what are some of these external then?
Okay, well, the first thing is Montfort's going to say, I'm going to recommend a few of these. Okay, now, what he's going to say is, we want to be careful. There's a couple of these that are really essential. And others that Montfort finds are very important, very useful. But he's also going to say there are others, which I'm not going to talk about here. What he's really saying is you need to find the cluster of practices that make sense in your life. Okay? And we need to remember that. What Montfort does not want is a slavish reproduction of what he has here. Right. What he wants is a healthy spirituality that will say, good, within this cluster of practices, here is a core that I can follow. And I supplement that now in my own life by letting the presence of Jesus come to expression and letting this devotion come to a concrete expression that makes sense in the context of my family, in the context of my career, in the context of where I spend my days. And so what we're doing here is we're not putting out a blueprint that's going to produce cookie-cutter devotees of Mary or cookie-cutter followers of Montfort. What we're doing is we're saying these are elements around which we can construct, and the Lord can help us construct an external way of living what's happening interiorly within us that's going to make sense and be an effective tool for our spiritual growth. And the first is the word we've been throwing around through all of these sessions, consecration. So Montfort says here, this act of consecration that we've been talking about, note, he's labeling that with the exterior practices, not the internal. In other words, Montfort is saying this act of consecration, which is so important for him, is the expression, the concrete form that this devotion he's been talking about and writing about will take. And he places this in the first place. For Montfort, this one is necessary. If you want to walk this way, if one wants to move this way, a formal act of consecration in some kind of public way is important, some kind of external way. And so for Montfort, he will talk about what I need to do then is I need to set aside time and energy and space in my life to prepare myself to do this. And that this is a moment that has some significance. But it is not a once and done reality. This consecration is supposed to be the expression of an internal reality which is stable within me and which I wish to deepen and grow in. And so then when he'll talk about deepening a consecration, renewing a consecration, what he's talking about is using this external set of actions, this external set of gestures, to be the expression of my internal spiritual growth. So this is not like, for example, a devotional prayer like the morning offering, where at the beginning of the day I offer everything to Mary and then move on. That's a beautiful thing to do, but for many it's a devotional prayer that is said. Montfort's saying this is not that. This is the expression of the desire of a life each day to continue deepening its self-gift, deepening its participation in Jesus, and this becomes the expression of that. In the same way, well said, the morning offering can function in that same way.
If you mean that.
Exactly, but Montfort is saying, let's not lose the point here. This is about the concrete external manifestation of an ongoing spiritual aspect of my life. Now, this word consecration, however, we've used it a lot, and we haven't talked about what it means.
That's going to be a whole show. Actually, we run out of time, but we're going to pick that up on the next program because this is just a fascinating series that we're doing here. We're at the approaching the end of it now, but we just ask you to really dig into it and make it part of your life. Visit our website at familyland.org and click on consecration. Learn how you can consecrate your family. Thank you for joining us.